majority population that was not Muslim. So you have by the 15th century. By the 15th century also, Islam in West Africa became associated with Sufi order or Sufi orders. Sufi orders are groups of Muslims that emphasize the spiritual dimension of Islam. Sufi orders are groups and associations that emphasize the spiritual dimension of Islam. And it's important to also speak about the role of the Sufis in spreading and diffusing Islam, but also in creating transnational links. Transnational links, in a sense you could say a global connections at the time, that also plays an important role once some of these slaves are taken into captivity. Meaning some of those who belong to these Sufi orders. Now, what we have is extensive Sufi orders in West Africa. And then there are a number of these orders that exist across North and Sub-Sahara Africa. Sufism, or the spiritual dimension of Islam, was transported into the New World via the slave trade. And therefore, what we find is some of these individuals that we will look at later on, that themselves represented the spiritual dimension of Islam in their captivity. In speaking about West African Muslims, West African Muslims belong to a larger network of Muslims and part of the larger Islamic world. Right, so they were not isolated, unincorporated, unconnected to the broader world. By the 15th century, we need to remember, and I know it's a little bit long history, Islamic rule extended from the borders of China all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, which would be Spain. 1492 is an important date from many ways, not only the arrival of Columbus, but 1492 also brings to an end the Muslim presence in Spain. Right? But the 14th and 15th century, when we speak about Islam and Muslims, we're speaking of a large body of geography extending from the borders of China all the way to parts of Spain. And as such, all the communities and ethnicities and populations that belong to this were part and parcel of this global network. And once again, when we say global network, we always have to be cautious that we don't think of it in terms of modern globalization, where we just take more of what you have and give you less of what you don't have. Right? So in here, they were part of a global network that extended from one end of the known world at the time all the way to the other. Therefore, we could say that West African Muslims had direct economic, religious, cultural ties to North Africa, to Egypt, to present-day Saudi Arabia, to Iraq, and also were traveled in many parts of the Muslim world, including possibly reaching to present-day India and China if they were engaged in trade. And so as such, they were not, as we often being introduced, that they were uncivilized. It's actually almost the opposite was the norm, rather than what we tended to represent them. Even today, if you read some of the literature on the slaves and where they originated from, the dominant feature is almost speaking about them in terms that still indicate that they were uncivilized, and that term uncivilized is problematic, but that's the term, savages, barbarians, and so on. And I often say that anyone who writes this represents their mental state rather than the object or the communities that they describe. So I think it's important for us to constantly deconstruct these notions. So Muslims of West Africa were well-traveled. Well-traveled. Why? Because at least large number of them committed themselves to going to the pilgrimage. Right? There's once a year they had to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. And communities used to go out to the pilgrimage from various parts of the Muslim world, including from North and West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. In order for you to perform the pilgrimage, you had to travel. And to travel, you had to cover large distances. Today, it takes you 18 to 20 hours by the plane. In the olden days, it'll take you a whole year, almost 6 months going and 6 months coming back. Right? And communities and individuals did that on a regular basis. So they were well-traveled across many parts of the Muslim world, from the pilgrimage as one, to trade. They were connected to trade routes. So they traded in Sub-Saharan Africa, they traded on the coast, they traded to North Africa, they traded to Spain, and they traded to Egypt, and also crossed to other parts of the Muslim world. Second, Muslims were urban. There were cities. Right? These were urban individuals, even though there were people that still living as nomads, but that's not the primary feature of Muslims, both in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. For example, in your social study or humanities studies for high schools, when you have the picture, you have images about communities. When they represented the Muslim world and the Middle East, they actually put a picture of a camel. Every other group, they had a picture of an individual dressed in their traditional dress. When it comes to the Arab and Muslim world, they put a camel. I said the only time I saw a camel was when I visited the Auckland Zoo. Right? But that representation is important because we still try to replicate a particular image of what the Muslims, Arabs, Middle East is all about. Even today, we still think, right, that they're basically way back in development, and not realizing that the urban nature of Muslims were dominant from early on. And as such, West and Sub-Saharan African Muslims had cities. City of Timbuktu had was a major intellectual center. Even today, when you visit Timbuktu, they have close to 3 to possibly 5 million manuscripts that are untouched. Can you imagine? These are manuscripts from the earlier periods, right, of development. Henry Gates Jr., who went there during his document, he says he felt like a child in a candy store that can't eat any of it, because all of these manuscripts were in Arabic. Right? So you had major centers, major powers and dynasties that were in existence in here. So these were well-developed societies and well-developed communities. At the time of, once again, it's 14th, 15th century. When we say developed areas, we need to compare it of the period of 14th and 15th century. So we don't think, oh, we're trying to compare it to San Francisco. Right? You have to look at it in that period, and what were those individuals, those communities, how did they look like, what type of cities they lived in, what type of structures they have, what types of economy, and what we realize is that they were fully developed as a community. Third, we said they were well-traveled, urban. Third, these were literate and well-read. These were literate and well-read. meaning literacy, and this is actually, you could look at it in terms of studies, and Silviana Diouf looks at the number of schools, the number of teachers that were present, and the literacy was not only exclusive to men. Actually, literacy was both dominant or present both in men and women, and some major women figures likewise were educated, and they were part of an intellectual infrastructure, right, in that period. They had interaction and literary interaction with the major centers in Iraq, in Baghdad. There were interaction with the centers in Spain, in Cordoba. There were interaction with centers of knowledge in Morocco. There were interaction with Egyptian. And how we do that, how we understand that, we see what type of books they have, what type of materials were read, where are the books are coming from. And they had full libraries that were in operation. All right, some of these libraries had books that are in the thousands in these centers. All right, so literate and well-read. The dominant language of literate and read people were Arabic. Once again, that was the language of the totality of the Muslim world, where Arabic was the primary language of intellectual discourse. And as such, what we find is the literacy in Arabic was high, beginning with training in recitation or reading of the Quran, and then culminating in a variety of other subjects, including mathematics, astronomy, logic. All those were part and parcel of the literacy program. Fourth, Muslims in North and West Africa were seen as the catalyst for change. Catalyst for change and, quote, modernization. And, you know, I have a problem with the theory of modernization today, who is put modernization between two parentheses. So we don't prescribe the concept of modernization to our contemporary concept of modernization. So we don't go out, I want to modernize, you know, Iraq, or I want to modernize Afghanistan. All right? So for us, Muslims at the time were catalysts for change and modernization, and as such, they were seen as a communities to link with and engage with. Now, when we think about all these aspects, the question arises of what happened, right? What happened? Why would it be possible for such a society, right, that has all these positive attributes, right? So far, you know, Professor BAZIAN is just saying how great it was. Why doesn't he go back and live in that era? Right? Why don't you go back home to West Africa if you like it? Well, I always say, like, why don't you go back home? Right? Why don't we? I say, I took my green card from Native Americans, so if they tell me go home, I'll go, but until they say so, that's a different perspective. All right? But what happened? What happened to a society as such? Well, corruption, right? Corruption is a primary feature that tends to undermine societies. So there were corruption that entered into the picture. Wherever there is affluence, corruption is just lurking in the back. So with a whole host of affluence, engagement, literacy, urban, and so on, there were corruption that emerged. Rivalries, right? Rivalries, local wars. My chief is better than yours. My king is better than yours. Right? So rivalries between various local municipalities that resulted in fighting, conflicts, wars. Right? And whenever you have conflicts, wars, and rivalries taking place, resources tend to be zapped. And in here also we have to also point that